Hey everyone.
Hey.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We're here with Tom Schimmer. He's here this week helping us learn more about standards-based grading. So, our first question, what does feedback look like in your classroom?
That's a good one. You want to go first?
Sure. So feedback, it kind of depends what you're doing, but feedback should come in different forms and in relatable forms. So sometimes it can be as simple as a conversation, sometimes it might be in writing, comments on a process piece that we're working on. But hopefully it's feels like a conversation for students, that they're hearing where they're at and where they can go next.
Yeah, I agree. You do, like, the majority of what you're doing is formative feedback, right? And so you're working through to help direct kind of the understanding and so on as you go forward. And, sometimes that comes in more formal forms, but the vast majority of it really is going to be in that informal structure.
Yeah.
As you're teaching, you're constantly getting that feedback and directing how you're going to move through that lesson, I would say.
Yeah, I love all of that, because I think so often teachers think feedback has to be epic. It has to be so monumental and so heavy, when feedback is really effective in short bursts and making sure it directs next steps in learning and is fundamentally causing thinking. I think this is one of the things that we want to make sure with our feedback, is that feedback is not just a set of directions. You mentioned writing, like that's a great example of where teachers can sometimes get a little bit concerned that if I keep giving the feedback and the students improve their writing, are they really at that next level? And so often I'll ask teachers, when you look at your feedback, ask yourself this simple question, which is my feedback a set of directions, or does my feedback cause thinking? If my feedback causes thinking, then the student has moved themselves to that next level. If my feedback is a set of directions, then I'm the 4, or I'm that new level. So, but those short bursts, asking questions, causing thinking, using highlighters, those are great ways to cause feedback that really are efficient for teachers, but effective in advancing learning.
I notice that a lot of times when I'm giving written feedback on student work, I'm actually writing questions to them, even like, how might you, whatever I'm trying to get them to think about.
So the question nudges them to what you want them to think about, but it doesn't tell them what to do.
Right.
And that way, your feedback isn't interfering with their competence as you say, hey, what's a more effective way to grab the reader's attention at the beginning of this narrative?
And leave it open-ended.
Right, and they have to decide how to do that, and that's when you know that they're the one. You always ask me, who's the decision maker, right? Who's the one that's deciding what to do, and that's why questions are so effective for feedback.
I also find myself oftentimes, just in humanities, I'm oftentimes trying to get them to think about who they're communicating to. So a lot of times in my feedback, I'm saying, what might your readers think of this, or how might this be confusing to your reader, to direct them towards, because when they go on from here, they're not going to be communicating to a teacher. They're going to be communicating to a variety of different audiences, right? And so having that audience in mind and being empathetic to who they're communicating to is important, I think, in the learning process and how they communicate out their understanding.
Totally. Yeah, I love that.
I think similar thinking about when they leave the classroom, when they leave the school, feedback is hopefully helping them see themselves and see what they're doing. I always tell them, like, I'm not going to follow you around for the rest of your life telling you, like, oh, that's a 4, that's a 5. Like, you want them to develop the sense of, am I communicating what I want to communicate, or doing what I'm trying to do?
Giving themselves feedback, right?
Yeah.
That self-assessment piece for sure is a big part.
How do you, not to just follow up with another question,
Yeah.
but how do you, imbue that in your students? How do you get them to give themselves feedback? How do you train that?
I mean, well, I immediately started thinking of peer editing and doing peer editing process as part of the learning, where they're reading each other's work, which they can learn from that at the same time as giving one another feedback. And so that's a way to get quicker feedback, because it takes me a long time to get through 43 papers and get those back, whereas they can get much quicker, and we know that faster feedback is more valuable in that moment. Even when I'm giving speeches, I've always got the entire class kind of ready to give peer feedback and scaffolding that in a way where it's going to be positive and productive. We also sometimes talk about how do you receive feedback, right? Not all feedback is useful. The important thing is that you consider it seriously, that you actually do think about the feedback, but then you also think about it critically and decide, is that right for me? Is that right for this work? Some of it I might take, some of it I might put aside because it just isn't helpful.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the things that is so important because, as you mentioned, teachers are outnumbered. There's more of them than there is the teacher, therefore there is more access. Now the teacher's feedback is obviously more expert than the students, but a lot of students have much to tell one another about how they grow in their learning, and students have access to their own thinking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the question really is around, like, how do we get them to that place? Because sometimes the peer assessment situation involves that collaboration or that social dynamic. So one of the fastest ways to get kids used to giving self-feedback is to use exemplars and have them critique something that is not someone's in the room, but it's an anonymous exemplar. It does two things. One is it starts to get them practicing with the criteria. And two, it's a very safe environment to say, if you were talking to that student, what advice would you give them? And it's a kind of an anonymous exercise. And that starts to train them to critique and realize that it's okay to give feedback, and then that's self-feedback, and then we get into the peer feedback. And that's where the power really starts to happen. But once they're comfortable with that social dynamic and they know that it's a safe place, that I'm not going to get criticized and people aren't going to make fun of me, once we get to that level, that's when that peer assessment work can really, really take them to another level.
And that made me think of another thing that I've done in the past where I'll take like a paragraph or an essay and I'll have 3 different levels of quality. And so I'll have them, I don't tell them which is which, but I'll have them kind of organize, kind of grade and then organize them in order of what do you think is lower quality, medium, and high quality, and then talk about why. And that's a nice way for them to kind of get exposure to the things that make a piece of writing better.
Yeah. It's such a good question, though, because our learning our assessment fundamentals or becoming assessment literate is not the end goal. The end goal is for us to become assessment experts so we can teach the students how to do this for themselves. That is the ultimate end result, right? So that's why we have to know how to sort of create an assessment environment so we can coach the students so they don't need their teacher following them around every day after they leave. Yeah.
But it shouldn't be a mystery what they're turning in, right? They should already know the quality of the work that they're handing in. And that's where if they give me a piece of paper and that I haven't collected it as assessment yet, and they say, is it good?
Define good.
And I'm saying, I'll tell you when I grade it, but what do you think? You know, what are areas of this that you have reservations about, or that you're uncertain about, and we can talk about that, right? But I'm not going to grade it before I grade it, because you need to be confident in what you're turning in when it's time to submit the work.
You are making me think of a teacher, and her name eludes me, but she had this amazing strategy with feedback. And it really speaks to students having the agency to let the teacher know what level of feedback they're ready for. And so she had this strategy in class where she'd say to students, when you hand something to me, I'm going to ask you, do you want to be blessed, addressed, or pressed? and when the students were a little uncertain, like, I just want to be blessed right now. Am I on the right track? Am I going in the right direction? Which means we kind of withhold critique and we just say, yes, you're headed in the right direction. Do you want to be addressed? That means I'm going to talk about strengths and areas that need strengthening, and we're really going to push you to that next level. And then pressed means, I know I've got this. I want you to push me to make this much improved. And so I thought that was a really clever way of just giving the students a little bit of agency to say, like, what level of feedback am I ready for? So that if we start pressing them and they're not really confident at that point, we may actually cause them to recoil as opposed to lean into the risk taking and all of that. So I thought that you just reminded me of that strategy, because I thought that was a really clever way, and I wish I could remember her name to give her the credit for it, but I thought it's not my strategy, but it was a wonderful way of giving agency to kids and saying, well, this is the kind of feedback I'm ready for.
And like nurturing their confidence.
Right.
There's a dancer named Liz Lerman, and she has a critique process where before you get the critique, you tell people, I want feedback on this part of the thing I'm creating. I don't want feedback on everything, because I think a teacher could presumably go in and be like, oh, well, I think this is a problem, this is a problem. You start marking everything, and a student gets it. Where do they go with that? And then how do they feel excited to engage with that?
Yeah, and what they tell you probably does reveal their level of confidence in what they're doing, right? So yeah, that's great.
And then they're able to talk about their work and notice the strengths and weaknesses. I think
Yeah.
to your question, like how do you build it? It's having them do a lot of self-reflection. Like sometimes I feel like, do I do so much self-reflection that they're like laughing at me? She's making us reflect on ourselves again. But I think it really is like, how do they know themselves and what they can do?
Yeah.
So I think in school it's like they have 8 bosses, right? A different boss in every class. And so how do you move away from that feeling and move away from like, what do you know about yourself and what are you trying to do, and give them some agency?
That makes me think of a really important component of what I feel like we're headed towards, and that is using that reflection. So it's not assess and throw away.
Right.
It's assess and self-evaluate and strategize for my next move, right? And that's that constant cycle. So we're really not, and I really, what you said earlier today about qualitative feedback on formative assessments and really focusing on that piece. And I mean, I think you get better meaning out of that. That's a little antithetical of how I've looked at it, or I've been told, I should say, in the past. And there have been times when I've toyed with that idea in meetings and kind of been told that that's not okay. So it was refreshing to hear you kind of reinforce what I had, some ideas that I had before about formative assessment. But that reflection piece, I think, is something that we're going to need to look into institutionalizing throughout, so that we're building learning over the course of the year, rather than focusing on one isolated piece. That's gone, I'm never going to think about it again, and I'm going to go on to the new thing. And that kind of also feeds into building the reporting strands, right? So that we've got kind of themes that we're coming back to over and over again to build over the course of the year, so that we're looking, where can we get this where can we get our students by the end of the year, not where can I get them in 2 weeks, because that's not how learning works. Learning is a much longer process, right? But that we're building over the course of the year, and we're helping students to see how high can they achieve over the course of the year.
Yeah, that metacognitive reflective piece is how we help kids become self-regulated learners, right? The independence and being able to understand myself. I mean, you think about what is the ultimate thing that students need when they graduate, is to understand myself as a learner, to be able to self-advocate, to understand what I need, because I am going to be in a college environment where I have more free time. I don't have the teacher following me around. And what a lot of teachers maybe don't connect the dots to is understanding how assessment feeds that process, right? So assessment really is a cycle of where are we going, where are we now, how do I close the gap? And it's through those 3 points of assessment that we can actually teach kids how to reflect and be metacognitive about goal setting, about how I monitor my progress, how I reflect on the results, to what do I attribute my success. And that's why self-regulated learning and assessment have a symbiotic relationship. Each serves as an input to the other. And so if a teacher is ever wondering, how do I get kids to become self-regulated learners, it's actually through the assessment process that we can teach that and blend those 2 things together. Your point about formative assessment was a good one, because I do think that there's times where parents have the question about, why is some stuff not graded? Like, why are you not grading formative work, or why is practice not graded? And I think it's important that families understand that grades don't improve learning. Feedback improves learning. It's almost unanimous agreement in academia that that's how you improve achievement, is through feedback. And the worry we have, of course, in the research is that when formative grades appear, some kids will settle for scores that they're satisfied with and won't take the risk or push themselves to a new level. So it's important to know teachers don't need grades to teach, and kids don't need grades to learn. Grades are a necessary part of what we do, but the learning part is the qualitative feedback in the formative process. Yeah, I love that.
What about, I feel like time is part of this conversation, to stop and reflect on what you've done takes time.
Yes.
And to think about what's next takes time. It's not just rushing on to the next thing. And then also I feel like yesterday you were talking about learning should tell a clear story, and that will help ground students so they understand what's going on and I guess how they're progressing and growing, as opposed to just feeling they're being shuttled along a sea of getting grades, and then hopefully it works out, hopefully that teacher likes me. But I feel like time is part of it. I don't know if you have anything you can tell us about that idea of the
huge
story
part,
that you're developing over the year.
Because it's the story of my learning, the story of how I learn. which is not just the results, but it's about what is the journey or what is the trajectory. You know, I struggled with this and now I got that. How did I overcome that? How did I overcome those challenges? What is my story as a learner? Something that is very important. But, you know, the time part is hard because that's often the first thing that gets cut is the reflection piece at the end of a class. And we know how important reflection is and metacognition is to learning. So it's ironic that so many places that's the first thing we say we don't have time for, and yet it's one of the most powerful things that we can do is just to pause and kind of reflect on how I'm learning and what is the story of my learning journey. Do I understand myself as a learner? What do I do when I get stuck? And these are the types of reflection questions I think are important for students to consider. So at the end of a project, for example, it might be, think of a time during this project where you felt stuck or boxed in. How did you overcome that? And what did you learn about yourself as a learner?
Yeah.
Reflecting on that and almost forcing them to be metacognitive, to think about their own thinking and who they are as a learner. That's how we, and I hate to use the word train, but that's how we kind of train or reframe them to be reflective of themselves.
Could we just say build habits?
Build habits,
Good
sure.
learning habits,
It's
yeah.
just, it's getting them into that routine of thinking about how I think and how I overcame something, or what would I, if you had a chance to do this again, what would you do differently and why? That type of reflection helps them really think about themselves as a learner. So, but the time issue, we have to make the time, and we have to look at the time, my journey as a learner, so that I understand how I got to where I am right now. Because then I can make changes for how I'm going to go forward even more.
The other piece, I think, is highlighting how your learning behaviors or habits are the core piece that
Right.
produces that, right? So what
Right.
are all the different behaviors that you bring into the classroom and at home, right,
Yeah.
as well, that are going to produce that learning, right? Because if you have those pieces in place, the grades are going to come,
Yeah.
right? And oftentimes our focus is not on that piece. It's on the grades without thinking about how the behaviors that get you to the grades,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be interesting to look, how do we make sure that the spotlight isn't on the behaviors and the learned behaviors and habits that actually produce the grade later on.
Yeah.
I also wonder how, as we develop these habits in our students, like, is this the go slow to go fast? Like, if we do this, if we, you know, are heavy on this as a focus in the beginning of the year, what does it do to learning as the year goes on, as the kids become better at reflecting and it takes less time in the class? Like, is it simply a matter of the way we pace our courses? So maybe our first few units are really designed to help the kids develop those metacognitive, like, assessment habits, so that later in the year they're just doing it.
Absolutely.
I think we actually can zoom out even more from that perspective. There's no reason to stop and not do it for, you know, everybody should do it. But one of the things that I think about is that this is something that builds over time. When I work with kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers, I say, you know, you might not see the payoff of getting kids to go through reflection. You might not see it fully manifest, but what you're doing is you're building the habit. And so if self-reflection is something my cool 7th grade teacher did and then it doesn't reappear until the 11th grade, we might as well not bother. But if it's something we look at as a school and say, this is a habit we want to build, by the time the kids move through middle school and high school, this will be so habitual, the teacher won't even have to give the prompt to reflect because it's been a part of the process. So start now, but also think about, what does this look like, you know, K through 12? And how do we build this? Just, this is what we do at ISB. It's not just something a teacher does. I love the point about the habits of learning and how I learn, because that, I'll often say to families, you know, your child's academic grade is what will get them into college. Their habits of learning are why they will graduate from college.
Yeah.
They are very important, because when you have more free time in college, when you don't have the professor leaning over your shoulder, when you're away from mom and dad and you're not at home anymore, do you have the discipline to truly follow through on your responsibilities? And I think the kids that have those habits are the ones that are successful in college, because we don't want them just getting into college, we want them to graduate from college, right? So those are the habits that are going to help them do that for sure.
I really like this idea of framing assessment as like a tool to develop student agency.
Yeah.
I've never really considered, like, assessment is, you know, for me as a teacher to inform my practice, and it's also for the students to here's where you are, here's where you need to go. But I like this, especially in middle school, where we talk a lot about like executive functioning and how do we develop these habits so that kids can just exist from grade 6 to grade 8.
Yeah.
So yeah, using assessment as not just like another thing we have to do, but here's another way that we can help our students become better learners.
Yeah. There's always ways to develop that agency. There's always something in the learning that's negotiable, right? If the content is non-negotiable, like we have to learn about photosynthesis, well then how I learn can be flexible, or how I demonstrate my understanding can be flexible. So what agency I don't think, or what it's not, is making everything a choice, because some things aren't a choice, but it's where it naturally fits is giving students the opportunity to make a choice or a decision about the direction that they want to learn, or how they demonstrate their learning, or how they show what they know, and that opportunity for them really empowers them to feel like school isn't being done to them, but that they have the opportunity to guide and direct their learning in some way, shape, or form.
Sorry.
Well, could you talk more about that?
Yeah.
I think that is a growth area that we have. I think it is adding more choice and variety, maybe to how we assess and how can we, as a teacher community, talk about that.
Right.
Like how do we offer variety, choice, options,
Yeah.
thinking about universal design for learning
Right.
to our, how do we start to bring that to our assessment? What would be like the beginning steps to really start shifting?
The beginning steps would be, there's two sides to this coin. One is we want to give kids agency. The easy part is to say, here's what you need to show me what you know in whatever way you want to. However, the challenge for the teacher is when the student demonstrates their learning in what we might call an atypical manner, can the teacher recognize that the learning has occurred, right? So we may limit their choices in the beginning, not because we're trying to restrict them, but because we're trying to also increase our skill at being able to recognize learning. So you could show it to me this way or that way, right? You could do it in a written form, you could write an essay, or you could do a project. And so the negotiability is always somewhere in the curriculum, right? So if we're doing argumentative writing, well, that's non-negotiable. You have to do claim, evidence, reasoning, acknowledge counterclaim, and all of that. But what you're arguing is up for choice. Like we don't all have to argue the same thing. So I can have agency on what I'm arguing. If the content is non-negotiable, then the skills might be flexible in the choice. So you're always looking for something. If the skill and the content is non-negotiable, then maybe how I show my learning. So I don't think it's forcing it where it doesn't appear, but it's getting used to the idea of looking at where could we offer some choice. And I think for teachers, it's the adage and the cliche, think big, start small. What would you be most comfortable with? Giving students choice in what they argue. Okay, then let that be the one thing you start with. And then slowly over time, you begin to grow that repertoire and you start to work with your team or your department to say, let's really push their thinking on these atypical ways. Because there's a lot of ways to demonstrate learning, but sometimes our limitations of what we're used to receiving as evidence restricts those choices. And so I think it's just starting to push the envelope. And if the students have a proposition for you and they say, I'd like to show my learning this way, then ask them to tell you how that is going to show competence with the standard so you know what to look for, because they're going to give you an indication, right? So if they say, hey, we want to do a video, we want to do a little mini movie about this, and say, okay, I want to see a script, and I want you to tell me sort of within which parts of the scene am I looking for to see the demonstration of learning. Things like that can really help guide their choices, because it isn't a free-for-all. It still has to be to show competence in learning. So that's an example.
So then having a very clear rubric would become key, right? That everyone can understand.
Yeah, and that's why the rubrics are not task specific. They're associated with the learning, because now if each of the four of us showed our learning in a different way, we wouldn't need 4 rubrics. We need 1 rubric, because the rubric isn't about how we've demonstrated our learning. The rubric is about the learning that's being demonstrated. Right? So we only need 1 rubric, because the rubric is associated with this singular standard or learning goal. We just happen to have demonstrated it in 4 different ways. And that's efficient for teachers and actually effective for students.
Yeah.
One thing I've done, and you can give me your I'd love to have a little feedback.
Sure.
So one thing I've done is, so we were studying about Eastern and Western philosophies, making comparisons. They ended up making a comic book where they pulled in these different philosophers, and they had like a kind of a fight out, but they used word bubbles, thought bubbles to show the thinking that these different people would have about their philosophy and their thoughts on their opponent as they were going through the comic, right? But that's hard for me to know. So they've written these things. Do I know that they understand the deeper meaning of it? So what I did was come back around and using the rubric formed kind of a scaffolded reflection. And they wrote then about the comic that the team had made. And this is the other thing, is they worked together as a team. So how do I know what each individual understood from that process? So by writing that reflection that was built off of the rubric, so the questions were targeted to go to different aspects of the rubric, they were able to write their understandings on those different components.
Yeah. I love all of them.
Okay,
I
cool.
love all of them because you're, no, it's not for me to. I mean that first of all, it is hard to be succinct.
Yeah.
So when students are writing this comic book, like anybody can be long-winded. But this is what I used to love about old Twitter, was you had 140 characters to say something coherent. Like you have to be sharp with what you say. So if I'm going to write a thought bubble in a comic book, I don't have room to waste. So being succinct is something that I think shows a depth of understanding, if I can take something complex and say it in a very clever way. The other part I love is the co-authoring part of the comic book. We don't do enough of that in school. And yet, you look in society, like I've co-authored many books. Like most of the books I've written are co-authored with other authors. That's a very real world skill. You look at research, there's so multiple authors on the research papers, and yet for some reason in school, 99.9% of what we write is done individually, instead of trying for us to come together. And I love the fact that it's one comic book, it's one voice, it's one presentation, and the individual component at the end that says, I just need to verify that each of you has the level of understanding. We all know that in group projects, the most cynical part of it is I get into the group with the right kid, that kid carries the group, and I get to ride the coattails and get my grade. That's the classic sort of cynical side of group projects. It's not wrong that kids get the same grade by being in the same group. It's wrong if they get the same grade for the wrong reason, that someone carried the group. But if I get an individual reflection from 4 of the students who are in the group, and they're all showing me a similar level of understanding, then they all do deserve or have earned that same level. So everything you described there for me is just a super positive experience. We don't do enough collective writing, and that honoring that collective, because not everything is about the individual. Sometimes it is about the collective, and sometimes it is about being creative in a succinct way, and then that reflection piece. So I love everything that you talked about there.
Also, I'm guessing, did they have fun while doing that?
They loved it. They
God
were all
forbid
over
they
the
have
school.
fun while they're learning,
Yeah.
right? Can you
Yeah.
imagine?
And it wasn't like they didn't draw the comic. They had to pose in pictures.
Yeah.
So they were.
Oh.
They dressed up.
Oh,
as,
that's I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. We had.
that's-
Yeah.
I just, for some reason, like I don't know, we suck the joy out of learning sometimes, and I it's okay to have fun while you're learning, and be in that frame of mind that this is fun, and I'm having fun with my friends, and we're learning a lot. Yeah.
You were talking about time earlier, and I'm just thinking about. I mean, one thing I've heard throughout my teaching career that comes up periodically is assess better, not more, because if you get bad data, it's meaningless or it's not useful, right? But that's another way to free up time for some of these other important components of learning that are probably more important than bad assessment. So I think that's one thing to think about, is how do we assess less but better to get the good data to free up time for some of these other important pieces, like reflection, like learning behaviors, learning behaviors, right? That kind of thing. So.
Tom, could you talk about today, like on that subject, you talked about validity and reliability.
Yeah. I mean, they're kind of nerdy concepts when it comes to assessment, but the word reliability sounds very technical, and what it means is consistency. So in layman's terms, it kind of speaks to this idea that if 2 or more teachers are teaching the same grade level subject, they should determine grades in a similar or like-minded fashion. My grade should never be dependent upon who my teacher is, especially when it comes to a body of evidence. So it's something that we need to work on, because until we have reliable assessments, we can't make valid interpretations of the results. So validity is something that gets misunderstood. Validity is often referred to as this is a valid assessment, but there actually is no such thing as a valid assessment. You only make a valid interpretation or an invalid interpretation of the results. So that comes from reliability. So once we have reliable assessments, that speaks to the issue of quality versus quantity, right? I need the right questions that get to the right level of rigor, and it's the right evidence that I'm looking at, and it gives me consistent results and is a reliable measure. Now we can make a valid interpretation of those results and know that the grades that we are reporting are actually meaningful and clearly articulating where our students are on their learning trajectories, if you will. Yeah.
So on that topic, I've got a question. I've been in schools where you kind of create a new rubric for every assessment. You rewrite it basically every time. And I've been in schools where you have kind of a common set of language that you use for rubrics, and you use different parts of that, but they show up over and over again, right? So for instance, in communicating, you might have writing structure, and it's always, every time you're going to grade something that's related to writing structure, that piece is going to come in. Now it's generalized language, so it could be narrative structure, it could be essay structure, it could be report writing structure, but it's structure. We've taught some aspect of writing structure. Do you feel that whether having very task-specific rubrics or having more commonly repeated used language results in better reliability in grading?
For me, it's
Hopefully
for me it's about the task neutrality and the transferability, and it speaks to two things. One is that the issue at hand, the crux of it, is ultimately feedback. We have some rose-colored glasses when it comes to feedback in education, but like feedback is how we increase achievement, and I think I said that earlier as well. But feedback doesn't always work. And one of the reasons feedback doesn't work, according to some of the research, is that you can give students feedback on a specific task and improve the quality of that assignment, but in some cases the feedback doesn't transfer long-term to their long-term memory. So in practical terms, you would have a teacher who is constantly giving a student the same feedback and not seeing any improvement. So in some of the research, what emerged out of the research was that the reason some feedback is effective at improving the quality of an assignment but not transferring to their long-term memory is because the feedback was too task specific. So having a more generalized rubric does feel a little bit vague. So there's a trade-off here. It's not so vague that we can't make sense of it, but it describes quality and depth of understanding. Now, if we write another argumentative piece, or even if we do a debate, the feedback from that rubric the first time transfers to the second time, right? So it's a short-term, long-term gain thing, in that you might give feedback that doesn't improve this assignment in the moment, but over time, that transferability of feedback is what increases their achievement and gets to their long-term learning. So being task-specific, the advantage would be that it is more specific to the task at hand. But every time you change the task, you're now going to change the criteria. And for students, that represents a bit of a reset, as opposed to being able to look more longitudinally at their learning. So it really comes down to feedback. So how do I ensure my feedback is transferable? I make sure that my feedback is task neutral and connected to the learning, not the actual assignment.
You mentioned that there's a trade-off there if it's too generalized language. So could you supplement that with some task-specific clarification in that assessment? You could
do it two ways. One is you could add some task specificity to the rubric if you wanted to do that, or you could use exemplars, as we talked a little bit earlier, to say, for this particular assignment, this is what this means. Like, here's an example, right? And the transferability. So it really is about making sure that students understand that there is a connection between all of these things. So that actually opens up a lot of things, even cross-curricularly. I keep mentioning argumentation, right? Well, science and engineering practices also has one called making argument. So English teachers and science teachers and history teachers and others can talk about, how do we teach argument? How do we teach making a claim, supporting it with evidence, independent of the content? Because the structure of an argument is ultimately the same. Now, what I'm arguing is going to be based on the science content or the English content or or what have you. Yeah, so the transferability of the feedback is the key as to why. So when students are looking at rubrics, they might say, it's not specific enough. Well, it is specific enough to the learning. It's not specific enough to this assignment. The assignment is what we ask you to do to reveal that evidence of learning.
It sounds to me like it's going to be, because you started to talk about cross-departmentally as well,
Mhm.
so then it sounds like we're
Yeah.
going to need to make clear some transferability from, say, humanities over
Yeah.
to science
Yeah.
to math.
For sure.
So that there's language that
Mhm.
maybe isn't exactly the same,
Mhm.
but shows a
Yeah.
clear connection
Yeah.
across, so that they can...
Yeah, when you look at content, you'll see silos and differences between subjects, but when you look at competencies or skills or the underpinnings, you're going to see the overlap. You're going to see argument, you're going to see analyzing and interpreting data, you're going to see all of those things.
So this idea of the rubrics having consistent language that's used for multiple tasks, I like that because it is less language for students to decipher among their many classes, and I also think it keeps the teachers focused on what it is that we're trying to do and not getting caught up in
Yeah.
this revolution that we're learning about or whatever, but
Mhm.
thinking like, what is it we really want students to do? And I think that also will serve the students better when they go out into the world, because we don't know what the world's going to be like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So if they're able to think, how do I communicate? How do I maneuver? How do I interpret a situation? That seems more valuable to them for a future that's constantly changing.
Yeah, and that has an effect on students. It has an effect on parents too, and parents can start to understand what their children are learning, and parents can start to curb what they say at home or how they talk to their children, right? And just instead of asking like, what did you do in school today? Ask them, what did you learn in school today? Or how do you know you're being successful? And starting to ask questions, be inquisitive about how they know, what is the story of their learning. The promise of all of the grading shifts that the school is looking at is greater clarity and transparency and understanding how grades are determined, so that there is no mystery about, what is my grade, or how did you get that grade, or how come my child's not this grade or that grade. That type of mystery creates a lot of anxiety amongst students and parent communities. And so I think, as I look ahead to the shifts that ISB is making, I see a lot of anxiety reduction because there'll be greater clarity on how things are determined.
Yeah, and shifts the conversation from grades to learning.
To learning, yeah. Because grades reflect learning. So the output, these shouldn't be diametrically opposed. It shouldn't be about learning or grades. Grades are a reflection of learning. Therefore, to get a higher grade, you simply have to do more learning. Your writing needs to be more sophisticated. Your thinking needs to be deeper and more complex. It just really connecting those dots, then you don't have that false dichotomy between the two.
I think the task neutral rubric helps with that.
For
where
sure.
Here is the thing you need to do
Yeah.
to get a higher grade,
Mhm.
as opposed to here are the 5 things you need to do, and then next time it's going to be 5 different things.
Yeah.
So this is the one skill you will
Yeah.
need throughout the
Exactly.
Just the cognitive load is better.
Yeah.
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 All right, guys, thank you all for being here
Yeah.
in this great discussion. I've had some big takeaways. Hope you have too.
Yeah.
And hopefully we get to do this again.
Yeah, I'd love to.